Tom, I'd like to speak a little bit about the situation in Bosnia, part of the Balkan area. It's terrible tragedies that are going on in that part of the world. It has a long history, and there are important religious components in it that I think have to be looked at. We're looking at a fight between the Serbs, who are largely members of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and Croat Catholics, and Bosnian Muslims. So we have three different religious groups that are at work here. It's often been said that we will not ever achieve world peace unless we can achieve some sort of peaceful situation among the world religions. More and more I believe that is true, and we will not get that kind of situation among the religions unless we can have dialogue. There has to be open dialogue among these great religious traditions. In this case, the Catholics, the Orthodox, and the Muslims. So that's one of the elements that we find in the overall situation that has to be solved as we begin to look for solutions. We look at the history and we say we know somewhat of how we've got here. We've got this split between the Roman Empire early on in the 4th century, into East and West. We've got a long history of people within this area looking towards Rome to the west and being influenced by them. We have other people looking to the east, to Constantinople, being influenced by them. We have people different alphabets in this part of the world. And so we have different political histories. So we have to keep all of that in mind. But the real question at hand is, what are we going to do about this as a world community? How are we going to keep from this ethnic cleansing from running its horrible and tragic course of wiping out people? We've got stories of a couple 100,000 people being killed and people in detention camps. We've got 2 million refugees in this part of the world. This is a major kind of situation, and I think as people begin to hear about some of the cruelties, the tortures that have gone on in these detention camps, there is a general revulsion that says we have to do something about it. So I want to focus our attention a little bit on seeing this situation and how it's fraught with danger, the current situation, and how we might begin to look for some solutions and the kind of alternatives that people are speaking about these days.
Well, I think you've certainly defined the problem very well. And I think to put this in historical perspective, we have not just. I think we have more here than just Serbian nationalism, as expressed through the actions of the Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I think it goes much deeper. It goes to a long history of relations which have been based upon ignorance, fear, and which in turn have produced injustices as perceived by ethnic minorities within the various countries of what is referred to as the Balkan nations or Central Europe. And these injustices have produced violence, and what we're seeing today, I would argue, is just another example, another manifestation of long-standing evils of statism or of nationalism when it is placed when national aspirations are not governed by a legal or political order which restrains the kind of injustice and violence by one people against another, as is now happening.
I think one of the catalysts for this these antagonisms coming to focus today and the Serbian nationalism combined is this fellow Slobodan Milosevic, a person who is now president and reelected as president of what is left of the former Yugoslavia, and a man who himself is rather anti-religious and who has become sort of the focal point of this nationalistic fervor. And I think many people believe that he is really a major cause of what has happened. I mean, one theory is that there is a nationalism among Serbs who live in Croatia and among Serbs who live in the enclave in Bosnia that is going to flare up anyway, that if a national leader took hold, like Milan Panic, if he had won the election, that he would have a terrible time controlling the nationalist elements within these other provinces, that of Bosnia and that of Croatia. But be that as it may, Milosevic appears to really be a horrible figure in all of this. I mean, a person guilty, as the United States has suggested, even of war crimes, and needs to be brought before the tribunal of national and international opinion.
Well, we have to recognize that Slobodan Milosevic is a former communist leader, and he succeeded Tito. I'm not sure if there was anybody between Tito's death in 1980.
They had a nine-man ruling group in there for a period of time. Tito died in 1980, just to keep some perspective on this. And Milosevic has been in power, I think, the last 4 years or so, something like that.
And to give the devil his due, Tito was a murderous dictator, and had he had the same power as Stalin, I think history will judge that he would have used his dictatorial powers to create as much death and havoc as Stalin did in Russia, had he had the opportunity. He just didn't have as big a country to wreak his power in as Stalin did. He was a communist dictator of the worst kind. But he was not. Having said that, he was not. He did not play upon the simmering national or ethnic hatreds as this guy Milosevic is doing. Is doing. So Tito was a dictator and set up concentration camps that some of the people who there are stories, for example, that people who were in Tito's concentration camps after the Second World War, who had also been at Buchenwald or at Auschwitz, they said the German camps, if you can imagine it, were mild by comparison to the concentration camps that Tito set up. So you can say all that about Tito. He was a terrible man, a dictator who had many people killed just because they disagreed with him. He was a rabid Marxist. He was not what some of his propagandists convinced us in the West at the time he was. That is, a kind of a Democrat in disguise, fighting Marxism. He was a Marxist to the core. But having said that, at least he was not somebody who fanned the hatreds, the nationalistic hatreds that have simmered in that area of the country ever since the days of the Habsburgs.
Tom, I think that it is worth noting that in this election of Milosevic, where he has defeated Milan Panic, that one of the factors in that is the fact that the ethnic Albanians who are in Kosovo. Now we got to remember, there's all these different provinces that make up the former Yugoslavia. You had Slovenia and Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia, and you have this area known as Kosovo. Now you got about 90% of the people in Kosovo are Albanians. And these Albanians would largely want to get rid of Milosevic, but they decided to sit out the election. It's one of the reasons that Milosevic was able to win the election. So they sat out this election. Now, one of the theories here is if the Serbs come in, the people in Kosovo are being persecuted terribly. Their schools have been closed. They have almost no human rights. Their situation is just horrible, and it is degenerating rapidly. Now, the question is, will Milosevic decide with this new, winning this election, that he is going to send Serbian troops in to take over even more of this situation in Kosovo? If then Albania gets upset with this and doesn't like the fact that their 2 million ethnic Albanians in Kosovo are being attacked, and they decide to come into the war, now we've got the chance of the war spreading. We've got another chance of the Balkans initiating larger conflicts in the world. It's happened in World War I, as we know, in 1914 with the assassination by a Serbian nationalist of the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand. So that is to sort of set the scene again here. When you begin to look at solutions to all of this, one of the things people are saying is you got to watch Kosovo. You've got to make sure that the Serbs know they cannot invade that part of the world. It becomes almost for us like a Kuwait-Iraq situation. We're going to draw the line, and if they come in there, there's a lot of talk that we would have to intervene militarily. because of the great ramifications of all of that. So that even, again, complicates this whole question, it seems to me, as to what solutions we have. So one of the things people are saying today, let's not let that happen. Let's let Milosevic know that he better not try to make things worse for the ethnic Albanians. Right now, their leaders are cautioning them to be nonviolent, not to do anything, really, to provoke these Serbian nationalists who are really wreaking havoc on their country.
Well, it isn't just the the Albanians in Kosovo. It's also what's happened since the breakup of the Soviet Empire in 1989, which should give us pause. After that happened, of course, what happened was the Serbs under Milosevic fell upon the Croats, and they've long coveted, the Serbs have long covered particularly the Dalmatian coast because of its there's many resorts along there, and it's a very important source of tourist revenues.
This is all part of this establishing the Greater Serbia.
The idea of Greater Serbia.
To a time when they really were the dominant power in the Balkans before the Ottoman Turks took them over, and before they had to deal with the Islamic forces.
And it's all done in the name of protecting the rights of one group, namely the Serbs, and it's all done under the pretext of making either historical claims or protecting Serbians living either in some areas of Croatia or Serbians living in Kosovo. Of course, the violence now ongoing in Bosnia and Herzegovina is being carried out by local Serbs, and one of the issues is whether or not Milosevic, for all of his cruelty and his barbarism, whether he really has that much control over the local.
Right, always a question, and no one's really sure of that, but I think that many people feel that if Milosevic could be gotten rid of in some way, that it certainly would not be as powerful a force. Tom, let's get, I want to get a counterbalance in here. We portray the Serbs and Milosevic as the heavies in this. We have to remember that they themselves have undergone a lot of persecution in their history, and I'll just remind you a little bit of that. When the Serbs in Croatia during the Second World War suffered terribly, and many of their churches were decimated, and they were put in camps, and many Serbians were killed into the hundreds of thousands even, often estimated, although no one knows for sure. So let's get that in the mix as well.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned Milosevic. That brings us back to Anton Pavlic, who was a Nazi collaborator who headed a group called the Ustashi during that period.
A fascist
type group, and Pavlic was one of the cruelest figures of the entire history of the Balkans. There have been many murderous, cruel figures, but Anton Pavlic, who was a Croat Nazi collaborator, as you point out, was responsible, and his group Ustashi was responsible for the murder of many men, women, and children of Serbian descent during that period.
There's another name I'd like to get into this as we try to keep perspective on, and that is Cardinal Stepaniak. Many people remember a Croatian cardinal who eventually spoke out against these Ustasi movement and tried to rescue the Serbs in some way, and then he later, when Tito took over power, was thrown into prison, as you might recall, and became a folk hero to the Croatian people and to many Roman Catholics around the world. I can remember growing up and hearing about Cardinal Stepaniak, a great martyr to the faith and someone who stood up for the rights. On the other hand, among the Serbians, Cardinal Stepaniak is a bad man. That is, he didn't speak out soon enough. It was only later, after all the damage was done in the Serbian mind, that Cardinal Stepaniak really tried to stop this horrible slaughter. And Tito branded him, and I think partly got that idea across in the West, that Cardinal Stepaniak was really one of the bad people in this whole scenario that unfolded. So he is a sort of pivotal figure. What say you about Stepaniak tells you where you're at on a lot of these questions.
I think so. When you mention Stepaniak, you can also mention Mindszenty in Hungary, or more recently Václav Mali in Czechoslovakia. So, but I mean, that brings us, it seems to me, to we've now sort of framed in a very general way what's been happening
We must look at the solutions.
And what are the solutions?
Tom, let me just say something about from the religious viewpoint, because I began by saying I don't think there's any solution apart from a religious solution. I know there are religious writers who claim that Cyrus Vance is sort of on the wrong track in trying to do a lot of negotiating because he isn't keeping the religious element in mind. Now, let's just begin to sort that out a little bit. We do know that the Orthodox Church within Serbia did mount some critique of what is going on in Bosnia and what was going on in Croatia. I don't know if you remember that or not, but it was on television where Orthodox bishops, in a very courageous move, were going against Milosevic's policy. Now, traditionally, we know the Orthodox churches have tended to be more nationalistic than, say, the Roman Catholic Church has been. When you look at Croatia, it seems as though the Catholic Church there has been able to be somewhat critical, somewhat distanced from the government, whereas in Belgrade and in Serbia, there's been much greater identification. But the Orthodox did speak up against some of these atrocities. And that reminds us that right within Belgrade, within Serbia itself, there is opposition to Milosevic. I mean, you still had a lot of people who voted against him in the recent election. We should keep that in mind also.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I think that perhaps some people listening to this might say, well, look, we're basically suggesting that the great majority of Serbs are supporting this man who seems to be put us in some sort of a time warp. We're back with Hitler and his concentration camps and so forth, and so that we don't create a misimpression here. I think your point is well taken. I think it's becoming clear that this election was heavily influenced by state television and radio. And in Belgrade, where you have the intelligentsia, Milosevic probably, I don't know, I haven't seen the final results yet, but Milosevic probably lost a majority of the votes in Belgrade, where you can't hide from the truth, and where where you have your universities and your more sophisticated people reside. Panic
instance is calling for elections,
for
new elections.
Yeah.
But the point you make, I think we really do have to keep in mind here,
point.
so you don't look at the whole Serbian people as involved.
It doesn't seem like a smear on the Serbian people.
Right, and in fact,
it shouldn't be.
Tom, if you look at it from this viewpoint, if there was a certain amount of election fraud that people think went on, and he had total domination almost of the television networks ahead of time, it makes it even clearer that a lot of people within Serbia itself do not support Milosevic. Let me go back to the religious thing, which I think there's some good things that have happened, Tom, that I wanted to get out here, because there was a meeting, and this on September 23rd of 1992, between the Patriarch who resides in Belgrade, that would be the Orthodox Patriarch, and the Cardinal Archbishop of Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. So what they did, were able to bring together two major figures here, religious leaders, and they issued a joint statement. And they did speak about the injustices that were going on. They spoke out in terms of human rights, the dignity of every person. They rejected hatred and violence. And they tried to look for some sort of common solutions. Now, this is an example of what I'm talking about, that you have to have religious dialogue. It's interesting, in that September 23rd meeting, there was an effort to get the Muslim leader from Bosnia as part of it, but they didn't succeed in doing that. But he himself, the Muslim leader from Bosnia, later on did make some statements about being against this. He quoted the Quran, incidentally. The Muslim leader said, "Whoever kills a human being, except as a punishment for murder or other wicked crime, should be looked upon as though he had killed all mankind. And whoever saves a human life should be regarded as though he had saved all mankind." This is out of the Quran. Tom, the reason I think this is important, because a lot of people have a fixed notion of Islam as being totally violent or militaristic. Now, they've had their history that way, there's no doubt about it. And they certainly do not have the kind of notion of forgiveness of enemies that we find in the New Testament. They don't have a notion of redemptive suffering like we see in Jesus Christ, no doubt about that. But you do have this kind of thing. Another quote from the Quran: "The nearest in affection to the Muslim faithful are those who say we are Christians, because they have many men devoted to learning among them, and because they are free of pride. This is a statement, optimistic statement about some of the people of the book, the Christians, found within the Quran itself. Well, when the Muslim leader gave his retelling of this and issued his statement, he played up that kind of thing. So you got three religious leaders, at least in a tiny, tiny beginning way, trying to get some dialogue going. I see this as a harbinger of hope in a terribly dismal situation.
Yeah, and we could use this terrible tragedy as a basis for creating some common ground in our discussion, and in reaching a point where we can have a universal condemnation of the underlying injustices which breed the violence, and which bring us to the situation where it seems to me the whole world is beginning to recoil at what is happening there. If we can use the horror of what is happening as a basis for a dialogue by leaders of the great faiths, and from that dialogue comes a recognition that it is time for the world to find a common moral ground for condemning out of hand the kind of mindless violence that this man Milosevic is wreaking on the innocent people.
I think that, one other religious element I'd like to get in, and it's peripheral, but it has a bearing on how Americans react, because people need to realize that Medjugorje, where many Americans have gone with the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, is in Bosnia. I mean, it needs to be, and that has stopped. The war has stopped that whole flow. And we have many Americans, and I know many of them personally, who have been to Medjugorje, have been very influenced by it, and maybe there's sort of a moral outrage that can be gotten among that group of people that says, what a horrible thing in this land of Bosnia, where Sarajevo is the capital. Think we had the Olympics there. Yes. We had the wonderful spirit right in Sarajevo. Yes. Now that city's been under attack for 8 months or 9 months, whatever it is, and all these people dying. And then we had the Blessed Virgin Mary appearances, Medjugorje, tourists, pilgrims, miracles, people, religious consciousness change, all in this troubled spot. So what I'm thinking part of the solution is religion has to get into the mix to be a force for good in all of this.
Yes.
Elie Wiesel went there, and went to some of the detention camps, the Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, and has made eloquent pleas to the world community to speak out on this in any forum. I mean, I suppose that's one reason you and I are speaking about this now in some tiny little way, to raise consciousness about these people in these detention camps, horrible things that are going on, and a religiously oriented people, whatever their background, need to come together to try to overcome this kind of thing.
Yes, and I think an argument might be made that while what we're doing in Somalia through the United Nations is very good, and while we should always strive to preserve and protect human life against the ravages of hunger, those kind of natural catastrophes, as are now occurring in Somalia and some other areas, specifically in Africa, pale by comparison, it seems to me, in terms of the moral evil involved. They pale by comparison to the kind of actions that we're now seeing in Bosnia.
Yes.
And so what I'm really saying then is it seems to me that if we can make the kind of commitment which we're making in Somalia, and which I for one am pleased we're making, it seems to me that we can now we can find the will, the political will to respond to this man. And let's make it, my feeling is that once and for all, whether it's an Anton Pavlich or a Milosevic, we need to get rid of these people who would do that.
Yeah,
the Hitlers and the killers and the psychopaths need to be told there will be swift retribution through international mechanisms when they do these kind of things.
That's well said, Tom. Tom, I wanted to save just a little bit of time here, once you set that framework so well, to say, the kind of options that are being proposed. Is the idea of, should we put troops on the ground there? And people saying, well, you can't do that. It's mountainous. You'll get in Vietnam. You'll be in a quagmire. Many people saying, I said most people, I suppose, saying you can't put troops on the ground. Latest thing is, let's try to preserve the no-fly rule. Let's keep the Serbian Air Force from flying over Bosnia and wreaking more havoc upon Sarajevo and the surrounding area. That seems to be a possible solution. Some people are saying you could go further and bomb parts of Serbia, bomb their airfields, try to take out some of their weapons or munitions. On the other side of that complicated question, people are saying you can't do that because it's so close to civilian targets, and you'd get involved that way. So that, it's one of those typical things. Again, we can talk morally and we say we should do something when this is bad, but when it gets to the complex issues, it's hard to know exactly what to do. Ground troops seemed like it would probably be a disaster. Stopping the flying over seems a very possible thing to do, and we probably ought to implement that, it would seem to me. We even have some peace activists who are suggesting that we move in that direction.
I don't think, Jim. I think there are military means available that are proportionate and practical. For instance, we can I believe to some extent interdict the ability of the Serbians to get weapons, while at the same time we can go ahead and arm the Bosnians. Okay,
another way of going at it. Yes.
Yeah. And
that would be on the model of Afghanistan, I
yes,
suppose, where we armed
yes,
the rebels against the communist regime.
While at the same time letting them know we're going to have to do some politicking internationally. We're going to have to win a consensus, in the international community. But I like the idea of winning consensus for a eventual war crimes. I think the Milosevic's of this world need to know that the world simply will not tolerate, and they are going to have to. They are going to have to face an international tribunal and answer for their crimes.
Tom, well said, and brings us near the close here. We've been trying to look at the situation in Bosnia, much in the news, and we're revolted by what we've read about the detention camps and the continuing slaughter of people, the siege of Sarajevo, horrible events in history. Question is, what are we going to do about it? The religions have to play a constructive role. We've got tiny harbingers of this happening in the recent past with the Catholic and Orthodox talking, Muslims making positive statements. And then we look at the military solutions, and we're going to have to make hard decisions. But we should make them, as you suggested, on moral grounds where we try to find means that can indeed work and are proportional.